Hi, I'm Lisa from Lori's Country Cottage. Welcome to How Tuesday. Today is our fourth video in a series on figuring out how much fabric you need to make your quilt. There's so much information on choosing fabric for backing, we've split that series into 4 videos. Today will be the first video, how to choose backing for your quilt. Let's talk about how to choose and prepare your backing for the quilt. The first thing I want to mention is these aren't the only ways or even the right ways. Many of the things I'll suggest are industry standards. Some are just my personal preference. So, lots of people think, oh, the backing doesn't really matter on my quilt. That's not really true. The second thing people look at when they look at your quilt is the back. They look at the front and then they flip it over to look at the back. So your backing is important. You can choose to coordinate your backing or to contrast. Something to think about is the thread color for your quilting. If you're quilting with multiple colors of thread and you have lots of starts and stops, you might want to consider using a printed multicolored back. That way, you won't see all your color changes and the starts and stops. If you're using an all-over design or even custom quilting with one thread color, sometimes you might want to choose a plain color for your backing. Then when you look at the back, you see all of your beautiful quilting. Generally, you will see your quilting less on multicolored printed fabrics than you will on plain fabrics. I worry far less about the backing on my wall hangings than I do about my quilts. Generally, people are not looking at the back of my wall hangings. Now, how much fabric should you buy? Well, when I went to do this series, I realized that there is so much information and so many different rules for different sizes or widths of fabric, I've broken it into a series of 4. There will be 3 videos following this one for 45-inch wide backing, one for 60 to 70-inch wide backing, and one for wide backings, which are generally 108 to 120 inches wide. There are some rules that apply to all of them though. Always buy your backing at least 3 to 4 inches wider and longer all the way around your quilt. Now, if you're quilting on your domestic machine, you can get away with a bit less than that. But if you are having it long arm quilted, you need that extra fabric to attach your quilt to the quilting machine. It is recommended if you are buying cotton fabric, either 45-inch wide or wide backing, to pre-wash your backing. Wide backings in particular are usually woven less densely than 45-inch wide fabric, and they shrink more. So if you put that on the back of your quilt, you quilt it, and then you wash it and you shrink it, you will have puckering and bubbling on the back of your quilt, and sometimes you can even see that on the front of your quilt. How much extra should you buy? Well, we recommend at least 10%. If I make a fabric recommendation to you, I'm going to add 10% and I'm going to bump it up. Remember too that wide backs shrink in length for sure, but they also shrink in the width. So don't have tight numbers. Make sure you have plenty of fabric. If you choose Minky, Cuddle, Fireside, or Cuddletex, they're made out of polyester, and they don't need to be pre-washed because they won't shrink. If you need to piece your backing to make it big enough, make sure you pay attention to whether your fabric has a nap or a direction. Again, Fireside, Cuddle, Minky, and Cuddletex have a nap or direction. I don't care whether my nap runs sideways or up and down, but if you do, make sure you pay attention to what direction it's running. And if you've chosen a directional fabric, you're probably going to want it to run from top to bottom. Keep in mind also that most people who aren't quilters will not recognize the nap of Minky, Fireside, or Cuddletex. Most often, we have to piece our backings to make them big enough for our quilts. Here are some tips. Use a slightly shorter stitch length when stitching your two pieces together. Leave the selvages on, pin together, and then stitch with a 1-inch seam allowance. When you're done stitching, trim that seam allowance down to between 1/4 and 1/2 inch, making sure to always remove your selvages. Selvages are more densely stitched than the rest of your fabric. They will shrink differently, and they add unnecessary bulk when you're quilting. Now that you have it trimmed, press it open. Again, pressing it open reduces bulk on the back. And now give your backing a really good pressing. All right, I've pieced my backing. Where do I put that seam on the back of the quilt? This is where personal preference comes in. I like to ignore the seam. I pretend it's not there. What I do not do is center that seam vertically or horizontally. Those are often folding lines for our quilts, and sometimes that becomes permanent. If your backing isn't quite big enough and you plan to add quilt blocks or strips to the back of your quilt, like the example shown, don't try to plan them to match the front of your quilt. It is almost always impossible to match the front to the back. And if you plan quilting to accent that strip on the back, often you'll be disappointed. Again, don't try to align strips of fabric, if you have 1 or 2, with the front of the quilt. Almost always, it's a failure. Well, I think that should give you enough information to buy backing for your quilt. Join me in the next video where I will show you how to piece and choose 45-inch wide backing for your quilts. Thanks for joining me.